I'll never forget the sound of his laugh, that deep, self-satisfied chuckle that filled the entire dining room the night I told him about my dream. "You, running a bakery," my father-in-law, Richard, said between sips of his 12-year-old scotch. "Daniel, my boy, baking cookies won't pay the mortgage. Leave that kind of hobby to bored housewives." He didn't even look at me when he said it. He was talking to my wife, Emily, his daughter, across the table as if I wasn't even there. That night I smiled, pretending it didn't sting, but inside something cracked. Not just my pride, but the fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, I could ever earn his respect. I was a man with a dream, and Richard was the kind of man who measured worth in numbers and suits. He ran one of the biggest supply chain companies in the state, an empire built on contracts, connections, and a lot of arrogance. And I was just a guy who wanted to make bread. A year earlier, I'd quit my office job, burnout, empty purpose, the endless climb toward nothing. I'd had enough. My mother used to run a small bakery when I was a kid. I remember waking up to the smell of butter melting, sugar caramelizing, and the soft hum of her humming to old jazz tunes. Those mornings made me feel alive. So I took my savings and every ounce of courage I had left and opened Harvest and Hearth, a tiny bakery on the corner of Maple Street. Just me, one assistant, and a rented oven that groaned every time I turned it on. Emily supported me, or at least she tried to. But her father, he made sure everyone knew exactly what he thought. "Men don't need dough, Daniel," he once said, "they earn it." He loved lines like that, sharp little daggers disguised as wisdom. At family gatherings, Richard would throw me into the spotlight like a bad joke. "So Daniel," he'd announce, glass raised, "how's our local baker boy doing, still playing with flour?" The laughter around the table would follow, polite but sharp. Even Emily's smile faltered each time. It killed me. I wasn't lazy, I wasn't naive. I worked 16-hour days baking bread before sunrise, cleaning tables after sunset, and scraping enough money to keep the lights on. But to him, I was a failure dressed as a dreamer. He once handed me a check for $10,000 on my birthday. "For when the fantasy ends," he said, "you'll need it when reality bites." I never cashed it, I framed it. Because I knew someday I'd make him eat those words. It happened on Thanksgiving. Everyone was gathered in the living room, Richard holding court as usual, bragging about his company's new overseas deal. Then he turned to me with that smirk. "So Daniel," he said loudly, "how life selling cupcakes to high school girls?" The room went silent. Emily gave me a look, begging me not to react, but I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up. "You know what, Richard?" I said. "At least when I bake something, people smile. When you do business, people lose their jobs." The silence turned heavy. He stared at me, eyes narrowing, ego bruised. "Careful, son," he said coldly. "That kind of attitude can cost you more than you think." He was right, but not in the way he imagined. Because that night was the last time I saw him as untouchable. Fast forward 6 months later. Business was slow but steady. Word of mouth spread and locals started loving Harvest and Hearth. We sold out of our sourdough every morning. A local newspaper did a short feature, "The Small Bakery with a Big Heart." Then out of nowhere, something extraordinary happened. A food blogger from New York, passing through town, wrote a viral post about us. "This bakery doesn't just make bread, it makes people remember what it means to love what you do." Within a week, we had customers lining up down the street. I had to hire 3 more bakers. Our online orders exploded. Local stores wanted to stock our bread. Suddenly, the hobby became a real business. And for the first time, I didn't care what Richard thought. Until he showed up again. It was a rainy Thursday. I was in the back, kneading dough when I heard the bell chime. When I came out, there he was, my father-in-law, standing in my bakery, drenched, holding an umbrella worth more than my oven. "Daniel," he said, voice unusually quiet, "we need to talk." I wiped my hands and nodded, motioning for him to sit. He didn't order anything, just looked around the room like he couldn't believe people were actually there, buying, smiling, talking. "I have to admit," he said after a pause, "this is impressive." "Thanks," I said carefully, "we've been growing." He nodded, then took a deep breath. "I need your help." Turns out Richard's company, the mighty Havorson Logistics, was in trouble. Bad contracts, a data breach, angry investors, and the worst part, a public scandal about unfair layoffs that had gone viral on social media. His reputation was sinking fast, and his PR team couldn't contain it. He wanted me to help rebuild his company's image. Me, the baker boy. At first I thought he was joking. "You want me," I asked, "to help with your company?" He nodded, dead serious. "You have a way with people, Daniel. You built something honest, something people actually trust. That's what we've lost." It was surreal. The man who mocked me was now asking for my help. I should have felt triumphant, but instead I just felt conflicted. Because I didn't know whether to help him or let him drown. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were contracts, a consulting agreement. He wanted me to lead a new community engagement division with full creative control and a six-figure salary. For most people, it'd be an instant yes. But for me, it was like signing a deal with the devil. "Why me?" I asked quietly, "after everything you said?" He hesitated. "Because you were right," he said finally. "You built something I can't fake. People trust you." For the first time, he looked human. But the question still hung in the air. Was this humility or desperation? I told him I'd think about it. And that night, as I stood alone in my bakery, surrounded by the smell of fresh bread, I realized this was the moment I'd been waiting for. The tables had finally turned. When I told Emily about her father's visit, she just stared at me. "He actually asked for your help," she said, disbelief dripping from every syllable. "Yeah," I replied, "said he wants me to rebuild his company's image." Emily sighed, rubbing her temples. "That's unbelievable. Tell me about it." She looked at me, eyes softening. "Are you going to do it?" That was the question burning in my chest since he left the bakery. Part of me wanted to say no, to remind him that the man who once mocked me didn't deserve my time, my ideas, or even my mercy. But another part, the quiet, strategic part, saw an opportunity. He'd spent years making me feel small. Now he was on his knees asking for help. And maybe, just maybe, this was how I'd finally even the score. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything he'd said, about how people had stopped trusting him, how his company was falling apart, and how he needed someone like me, someone authentic, to help rebuild his image. I laughed to myself. Authenticity, the one thing he'd always mocked me for. By morning, I made my decision. I was going to do it, but not just to save his company. I was going to teach him something he'd never forget. When I walked into Havorson Logistics headquarters, every pair of eyes in that glass tower turned to me. The bakery guy, the family embarrassment, the son-in-law who used to smell like cinnamon and flour, now walking into the lion's den wearing a thrifted suit and quiet confidence. Richard met me in the lobby. "Daniel," he said, shaking my hand like we were strangers, "glad you're here." I followed him into a gleaming conference room, all marble tables, expensive screens, and silent assistants typing away. He introduced me to the board. "This," he said, "is Daniel Weston. He'll be leading our new community engagement initiative." The looks I got ranged from disbelief to thinly disguised amusement. A gray-haired man smirked. "From bakery to boardroom, huh? That's quite a career move." I smiled back. "You'd be surprised how much business you can learn from bread. It teaches patience and how to deal with things that rise unexpectedly." Some of them laughed. Richard didn't. For the next few weeks, I immersed myself in the company, meetings, memos, endless data. The deeper I went, the more rot I found. The layoffs that had sparked the scandal, they weren't just bad PR. They were cruel, unnecessary, and covered up with creative accounting. Entire departments had been axed just to inflate quarterly profits. The company was bleeding, but not just financially, morally. And Richard knew it. He just didn't care, not really. He wanted a miracle, something that would make people forget the truth. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting to save his company. I was walking straight into a trap of my own design. My first move was small, a rebrand campaign focused on the workers who hadn't been laid off. We shot videos of delivery drivers talking about their families, warehouse staff discussing their dedication, local community donations the company had made. We pushed them on social media under a new slogan, "Havorson delivers more than goods, we deliver trust." Within 2 weeks, the campaign went viral. Comments flooded in. Glad to see them making things right. These people are hardworking. Respect. Maybe they deserve a second chance. Stock prices ticked upward for the first time in months. Investors started calling back, and Richard, he looked at me differently now. Impressive, he said one evening in his office, pouring himself another glass of scotch. Didn't think you had this kind of bite. I smiled faintly. You'd be amazed what a baker can do when you let him near the heat. He laughed. You might just save my company. And that's when I realized he still didn't get it. Success breeds arrogance, and Richard was returning fast. The more praise he got, the more he started acting like he'd done it all himself. In board meetings, he'd repeat my ideas almost word for word, taking credit for every win. At first, I didn't care. I was too focused on the bigger picture. But when he started cutting my team's budget while increasing his bonuses again, I knew something had to change. He was back to his old ways, greedy, proud, ungrateful. And that's when the idea began to form. If he couldn't be humbled by failure, I'd humble him through success. His own success. Over the next few months, I built my department quietly, my own team of people who believed in real change. We created a parallel system, a clean, transparent division that operated independently from his old, corrupt network. Everything was above board, every dollar accounted for, every project honest. And the public loved it. Reporters started saying Havorson Logistics had a new heart, praising the company's ethics transformation, but behind closed doors, Richard hated it. He didn't want morality, he wanted money. He didn't want transparency, he wanted control. And for the first time, he didn't have it. One night during a company gala, Richard pulled me aside. "You're overstepping," he said under his breath. "You work for me, Daniel, remember that." I smiled, raising my glass. "I work for the company, Richard, the people who make it possible. There's a difference." His eyes narrowed. "Don't test me." "Oh, I wouldn't dream of it," I said. "After all, you taught me everything I know about what not to do." That was the moment the silent war began. A few weeks later, I received an email marked confidential. It was meant for Richard but had been mistakenly CC'd to me. It contained a proposal to shut down my department, effective immediately, and transfer all assets back under his control. In the justification section, he'd written, "The PR phase is complete. Daniel's role has become redundant. We'll take it from here." He hadn't even planned to tell me. I stared at the screen for a long time. The anger that rose in me wasn't just about losing my job, it was about everything, the years of humiliation, the mockery, the way he looked down on everyone who wasn't him. And that's when I decided, no, this wasn't going to end with him firing me. It was going to end with him exposed. I called my team together. "I need you all to trust me," I said. "We're going to finish what we started, but in a way they'll never see coming." We spent the next month building something new, a public transparency platform that showed every dollar spent by the company's community division. It was open, verifiable, and impossible to manipulate. And at the next investor meeting, we launched it live. I stood on stage presenting our new platform to hundreds of executives, journalists, and shareholders. "From today," I said, "Havorson Logistics becomes the first logistics company in the nation to operate with full community transparency. Every donation, every partnership, every expense visible to the public." The crowd erupted in applause. Richard sat frozen, his face pale. Because he knew I'd just made his old system impossible to hide. That night, Richard stormed into my office. "What the hell was that stunt?" he shouted. "Stunt," I said calmly, "it's progress. You had no authority to do that." "With respect," I said, "the board gave me full creative control. You signed the contract yourself." He glared at me, speechless for a moment. "You think you're clever, don't you?" "No," I said quietly, "I think I'm tired of pretending you are." He stepped closer, eyes burning. "I made you, Daniel, don't forget that." "No," I said, "you mocked me, you underestimated me, you tried to break me, but you never made me." He opened his mouth to say something, but before he could, his phone buzzed. It was the CFO. He answered, and I watched his expression drain of color. Because the board had just voted to make my division permanent, and to review his position as CEO. He looked at me with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he hissed. "Oh," I said, walking past him toward the door, "it's just getting started." Richard doesn't do quiet revenge. He's a man who prefers fireworks, the big, public kind that leave scorch marks on people's reputations and remind everyone who's in charge. The week after the board's vote, the office felt like a battlefield. I walked in every morning and watched the soldiers shift on both sides. My team, the ones who'd followed me out of a bakery and into a glass tower, kept their heads down and their hands busy. Reporters still wanted interviews. Customers still sent thank you notes. The platform we launched hummed with data and public praise. But behind the scenes, the tide had turned. It started small, an anonymous tip to the local paper about a supposed food safety violation at Harvest and Hearth. Then a social post from an account that looked suspiciously professional, alleging the bakery used cheap imported additives, a smear dressed as concern. Traffic to our site dropped overnight, orders canceled. One of our regular wholesale clients postponed shipments until things settled down. I called Emily first. "They'll stop at nothing," she said, voice thin. "I'm so sorry." "You're not the one who should feel sorry," I replied. "We'll weather this." We did what we always did: proof, transparency, and hard work. We invited a health inspector in, posted the clean lab results, filmed the process, showed receipts for local ingredients. People began to come back. But the campaign was coordinated. The posts multiplied. A short piece on a major business blog painted my turnaround as a staged PR stunt orchestrated by Havorson itself. The headline, "How a CEO Bought His Redemption and the Wife's Bakery That Made It Possible." The implication was clear: my bakery was a prop for Richard's recovery. It stung because it contained a sliver of truth. My work at Havorson did help the company, but it was twisted into a story about manipulation. And when Richard's people smelled blood, they went hunting. 2 weeks later, an email from Havorson's legal team landed in my inbox. It was curt and precise, language written by expensive attorneys who didn't bother to be human. "This is a formal notice that any further public claims regarding Havorson Logistics and its practices may constitute a breach of confidentiality and defamation. Cease and desist immediately." They wanted me to stop speaking publicly, to stop the platform, stop the interviews, stop the transparency that had made them look weak. I forwarded it to my own counsel. "Ignore it," Emily asked, sliding into my kitchen one evening, exhaustion in her eyes. "Or fight." "Fight," I said, "but we'll do it the right way." Legal fights are exhausting and expensive. Richard had both in abundance. I had scrappy lawyers and goodwill. It ought to balance out, but money is not the only weapon he had. Influence is the other. I started receiving calls from vendors. "We can't supply you this month. We've been instructed to put your account on hold." The quiet word at the end of every sentence was the same: Havorson. He tugged strings in ways I hadn't expected. Old friends in the council, business owners who feared losing contracts, people who'd taken his money and returned his favors. They were being leaned on. At home, our conversations began to circle the same drain. How long could we take it? Emily would wake up at night and whisper, "Maybe you should have taken the money when he offered it." She hated that the idea crossed her mind. We both knew she wasn't the only one who'd almost imagined what we could do with that kind of cash, but we'd chosen different things. "You're doing the right thing," I told her. "We're not selling out." She nodded, but the lines around her eyes deepened. I could feel the pressure building like the heat before a storm. If he couldn't stop us with money and influence, Richard would try to break us in other ways. He began to play the old man's game, whisper into ears, create doubt, and use fear as currency. A whistleblower within Havorson, a soft-spoken woman named Marta from the procurement department, reached out. She'd been with the company for 12 years and had always been the kind of person who believed in doing things the honest way. She told me things that made my skin crawl: off-the-books deals, shell companies that took inflated payments from contracts, bonuses disguised as consulting fees to obscure who had profited from the layoffs. She wanted to expose it, but she was scared. She lived paycheck to paycheck. She had a child in school and a mortgage. "They'll burn me," she said over the phone. "They'll burn my career." I told her I'd protect her. I'd moved through the company's corridors and felt how easy it was for a man like Richard to press someone into silence. The protection I could offer was limited, but at least we had allies in IT and a small network willing to gather proof. We started building a dossier quietly, emails, invoices, screenshots, statements. Marta fed us the pieces she could safely take without triggering alarms. It felt like gathering proof in the dark, each scrap a small, dangerous candle. At home, the fight widened. Richard's camp began a rumor campaign, little manufactured slights that spread faster than wildfire. Daniel's losing control, whispered over brunches. The bakery's not viable without Halvorsen. People who had once cheered us on started to murmur. Emily was a fortress and a fracture at once. She'd been with me at the bakery's opening, she'd risen early alongside me, and now she had an entirely different life, a daughter of a titan whose empire was slowly cracking. Her loyalty stretched like fresh dough, elastic, promising to rebound, but under constant stress. One afternoon, after a particularly brutal week of cancellations and a nasty article that questioned our hygiene despite the inspector's report, Emily came into the bakery and sat on the counter, staring at the flour-dusted tiles. "Maybe I should go to him," she said finally. "Maybe I should ask him to just stop." "You want me to go grovel to the man who framed us?" I asked, more sharply than intended. "No," she whispered, "I want peace." I wrapped my arms around her. "We'll make our own peace." But that night her father sent flowers, not an apology, not even a truce, just a vase and a card with the same old line, "For the family, Daniel, let's not let pride ruin this." The card's message was a cold thing. It looked like peace on the surface, but it came with claws under the petals. What made Richard dangerous wasn't only his networks or the fact that he could hire armies of lawyers. It was the way his supporters bent the truth into new shapes. They made the story about us, casting me as the ambitious interloper who'd overstepped. They made the narrative comfortable for people who would rather believe a tidy villain than follow a messy truth. One late night in the office, Marta sent me the file that would change everything. It was an encrypted folder she'd been unable to unload publicly, invoices routed through offshore accounts, emails with code words about reductions and marks, and a ledger that tied some of the unexplained bonuses to a small set of shell companies. Companies that once traced led not just to Richard but to people on the board who had been striking deals behind closed doors. There were names in the ledger I recognized from investor dinners, names I'd shook hands with and laughed with over seafood platters. For the first time in months, I felt anything close to righteous fury. "This is it," Marta said. "This is the rope around them." Before we could even plan how to release the evidence, the blowback began. A Friday afternoon call from the bakery's landlord. "We've got a complaint about the ovens. City inspectors are on their way." A smear on social media. An anonymous video of a kitchen with staged dirt and actors pretending to be disgusted customers. A subpoena, not for Richard but for me. Halvorsen's lawyers had filed an injunction claiming my platform had illegally accessed proprietary Halvorsen data. The language was convoluted, but the intent was clear. Freeze the platform, freeze the narrative, freeze me. I called Marta. "Did you send anything?" I asked. "No," she said, voice tight. "You should tell me if I did." "I didn't, but they know, they know." How? I thought. Who could have known we were building a dossier in the dark? Then I remembered the nights in the office when the network hummed weirdly. The nights someone had reconfigured access. The night someone with admin privileges had walked past our desks and smiled. "You think there's a mole?" Emily asked later, her eyes red. "Yes," I said, "and he's probably closer than we think." I called Richard and asked to meet him publicly in his office. Maybe it was naive, maybe it was bravado, maybe I wanted to look him in the eye and see if any of the man I once known was left. He greeted me with a practiced smile. "Daniel," he said as if I'd come for small talk, "how's the bakery?" "Surviving," I said. He leaned back. "You know, they're saying some unpleasant things about your behavior here, that you're using your status to push an agenda." "I'm using my status to do what I promised," I said, "transparency." "You must understand," he said slowly, "I can make life very difficult for people who undermine my company." He meant it to be a threat. I let it land. "I never undermined the company. I built a division that our community trusts," I said, "and I'll stand by it." Richard's eyes were hard. "You have a choice, Daniel. Walk away, save what you love, don't make this personal." He said it like a concession, but his thin-lipped smile said something else. "I've already started." That night I sat in my car outside the bakery, the engine a low, comforting hum. In my lap was a small USB drive Marta had slipped to me earlier in the day, the unencrypted copy of the ledger, the emails, the invoices. It felt heavy for what it was, a plastic stick full of proof that could topple men. I thought of every time Richard had laughed at me. Baking won't pay the mortgage. I thought of the check he'd handed me once for when the fantasy ends. I thought of every small humiliation, every public joke, every invisible knock that had been 1,000 tiny cuts. This was the rope Marta had spoken of. This was the moment to pull. I reached into my glove compartment for my phone to call Emily and tell her the plan. Before I could, my screen lit with an unknown number. "Mr. Weston?" a voice said. It wasn't one I recognized, it was careful, clipped. "This is Detective Alvarez with the county. There's been a complaint about your bakery. We need to conduct a search." My heart dropped like a scone thrown onto a tile floor. "On what grounds?" I asked. "We have a warrant," she said. "Please don't interfere." The line clicked dead. I sat in the car, the drive in my hand suddenly useless, the proof that could exonerate or destroy either hidden in plastic and encrypted with passwords I alone knew. The oven inside the bakery, the place I'd poured everything into, hummed obliviously. Someone had moved before we could. The war had stepped up a gear. We were no longer two people fighting a man of arrogance. We were an exposed operation with enemies who knew the right buttons to press. I thought of Marta, of the ledger, of the men whose names were on it. And I thought of one simple, terrifying idea. They weren't going to wait for me to decide how to use the evidence. They were going to act first. I took a breath, opened the car door, and walked toward the bakery doors, the bell chime like a small, defiant note in a very loud room. Behind me, the city lights blinked. Inside my jacket, the USB drive burned like hot coal. In front of me, the night was suddenly full of people who had already made their moves. I pushed the door open. And on the counter sat a plain envelope with my name on it. No stamp, no return address. Just Daniel Weston. I slid it open. There was a single sheet inside. A photograph taken from across the street. It showed the bakery's rear alley, our delivery door, a stack of boxes, a man in a dark hood standing in the shadows. On the back, scribbled in an elegant, familiar hand, "You don't know how far I'll go to win. R." My hands went numb. Some people throw matches, some people light the whole forest. And Richard had, apparently, already learned the taste of fire. They say every man has a moment where his pride is tested, where the world, or worse, his own family, looks him dead in the eye and asks, "Are you sure you're good enough?" Mine came wrapped in a tailored suit, wearing a Rolex that could probably pay off my student loans, and he smiled when he said it. "Daniel," he chuckled, swirling his whiskey, "baking is a cute hobby, but let's be serious, real men build companies, not cupcakes." That was my father-in-law, Richard Hargrove, CEO of Hargrove Dynamics, a 50-year-old manufacturing company based out of Massachusetts. Old money, old arrogance, old rules, and me, I was the guy who'd married his only daughter, Emily, and had the audacity to believe that starting a small-town bakery was a noble dream. At the time, I didn't know that moment, that exact sentence, would replay in my head years later as he sat across from me in my office, sweating, begging me to save his empire. But back then I just smiled, because I didn't have anything else. My story doesn't start with revenge, it starts with flour and a dream. I'd spent 6 years in finance working for a faceless firm where my only reward was caffeine and anxiety. I hated every second of it. Numbers were fine, but I missed creating things, I missed feeling. My mom used to bake when I was a kid. It wasn't about recipes, it was about joy. The smell of cinnamon rolls at 5 a.m. could make you forget your problems. So one morning, after yet another sleepless night in the office, I quit. Just like that, no plan, no investors, just me and a stubborn hope that I could turn that smell of joy into a living. Emily, bless her heart, believed in me, even when her father didn't. "Your father's going to flip," she whispered the night I told her. "Yeah," I said, "but maybe he needs to." She smiled nervously. "You know he sees business differently, right? He thinks success comes with suits and meetings." I looked down at my hands, covered in flour, already practicing for a future no one believed in. "Then I'll make success taste different." We opened Daniel's Dough 3 months later in a cozy corner of town, just 2 employees, one oven, and one promise: everything would be handmade, no shortcuts. The first week was brutal. I burned more croissants than I sold. Emily handled marketing, running social media, flyers, community giveaways. I remember our first customer, Mrs. Donnelly, the librarian. She took a bite of our cinnamon loaf and said, "You know, young man, this reminds me of my mother." That sentence nearly broke me, in a good way. Because that's what I wanted, to make people feel something again. Of course, that kind of dream doesn't impress a man like Richard Hargrove. He was a business mogul, the kind of guy who believed risk was fine, as long as someone else took it. When Emily invited him to our bakery's soft launch, I prayed he'd at least pretend to be proud. He didn't. He stood in the middle of my small bakery, looked around like he'd stepped into a peasant's hut, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "So this is what you left your six-figure job for, bread and pity." Bread and pity. The room went quiet. Emily shot him a look that could kill, but he just laughed. "You could have joined my company," he said. "Learned something real, built something big, but no, you wanted to play baker." I smiled even though my hands were shaking. "Sometimes big things start small, sir." He smirked. "Not this small." The first year nearly killed us. We barely broke even. I worked 16-hour days. Emily and I fought about money, rent, everything. There were nights I wanted to give up, nights when I'd stare at the closed sign and wonder if Richard had been right all along. Then something changed. One morning, a food blogger came in. She'd heard about the bakery with the guy who hand-rolls every croissant. She posted a video, slow-motion shots of the dough, the glaze, the steam. Within 48 hours, it had over 2 million views. We sold out the next day. Then the next week, then we started shipping orders out of state. People didn't just buy our bread, they connected with it. They sent notes saying, "This reminds me of home." Suddenly, Daniel's Dough wasn't just a bakery, it was a brand. And for the first time, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't a joke. A year later, Emily and I were invited to Richard's birthday dinner at his mansion. I almost didn't go, but Emily insisted. "Please," she said, "just for me." I told myself I'd be civil. He was already tipsy when we arrived. The table was full of people, executives, old money friends, investors, and then it started. "So Daniel," he said, raising his glass, "how's the cupcake crusade going?" A few people laughed. Emily squeezed my hand under the table. "It's doing well," I said calmly. "We're expanding to a second location." He smirked. Expanding debt, that's one way to grow." Laughter again. Then he leaned back and said something I'll never forget. "You know, Daniel, there's a difference between running a bakery and running a business. You'll learn that when this little fantasy of yours collapses." I didn't reply, I just looked at him, really looked at him. And I saw something I hadn't noticed before: fear. Behind the arrogance there was fear. Because deep down, Richard was losing control of his company, his family, his legacy, and he didn't even know it yet. 6 months later, I got a call from a reporter. "Mr. Hargrove," she said, "we're running a story on Hargrove Dynamics. Is it true they're filing for bankruptcy protection?" I froze. "What?" She hesitated. "We have documents suggesting the company in serious financial distress." That night Emily came home pale. "Dad's in trouble," she whispered. "The company's collapsing, something about a failed merger and missing funds." I didn't say a word, I just listened as she tried to make sense of it. Apparently, Hargrove Dynamics had overextended, bad deals, high debt, overconfidence. The same arrogance that had made him laugh at me was now eating his empire alive. Within months, Hargrove Dynamics was on every business news headline. "Family empire crumbles, Hargrove Dynamics faces bankruptcy, CEO under fire for mismanagement and misused funds." Richard's board started turning on him, suppliers pulled out, clients fled. For a man who had mocked small businesses, he was now begging for one, a lifeline. And that's when the irony began to taste sweet. Because the same people who had laughed at me at that birthday dinner were now reaching out, not to mock, but to ask. "Daniel, can you help?" It was a cold Tuesday morning when my phone rang. It was Richard, his voice was low, broken. Daniel, we need to talk. I could hear the weight in his tone. The same man who once called me a joke now sounded like someone drowning. I hesitated. About what? My company, he said. I need your help. I looked out the window of my bakery, customers lined up, the smell of bread filling the air. The irony was intoxicating. My help, I repeated. Yes, he said, almost whispering. I don't have anyone else I can trust. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying his words in my head. The same man who'd humiliated me in front of everyone now wanted me to save him. Part of me wanted to say no, part of me wanted to watch him fall. But another part, the part Emily had always loved, wanted to do the right thing. Not for him, for me. Because real power isn't in revenge, it's in being needed by the one who said you never would be. When I walked into Richard's office that day, I didn't recognize the man sitting behind the desk. Gone was the confident tycoon with his perfect posture and smug smirk. What I saw instead was a tired, hollow-eyed version of him, sleeves rolled up, tie undone, papers scattered like debris after a storm. He looked up at me slowly. Daniel, thank you for coming. I didn't sit right away. Emily told me things were bad. I didn't realize it was this bad. He gave a weak laugh. You and me both. I finally sat across from him. The air in that office felt heavy, suffocating, even like the ghosts of his decisions were still whispering around us. So I said carefully, what do you need from me? He leaned back and sighed. I need someone who understands branding, marketing, social perception. The world's changed, Daniel, and I haven't. He hesitated before continuing. Our reputation is dead. No one trusts the Hargrove name anymore, but your bakery, Daniel's Dough, it's respected. People love it. You built a story people believe in. I need that. He looked me in the eye and said words I never thought I'd hear. I need you to save my company. I should have felt triumphant. I should have laughed, reminded him of every insult, every smirk, every dinner where he called me the Cupcake Crusader. But instead I just felt conflicted. There was something about seeing a proud man broken that didn't feel like victory. It felt like watching a mountain crumble in slow motion. Why me? I asked. He shrugged. Because people like you, they trust you. You built something honest, and his voice cracked. I built something that looked strong but was. For a moment he wasn't the man who mocked me. He was just a father, scared, desperate, and ashamed. Over the next few weeks I became something I never thought I'd be, an advisor to my father-in-law's failing empire. He gave me full access to the company's books, and what I found was chaos. Debt piled on debt, bad contracts, inflated costs, and a culture that was as toxic as it was outdated. His employees were miserable, his marketing was stuck in 2005, his brand image tarnished beyond recognition. If this company were a building, it wasn't just cracked, it was burning from the inside. So I made a plan. I called Emily that night. Babe, if I do this right, I said, we could actually turn it around, but it'll mean working closely with your dad and his board. She hesitated. Are you sure, after everything he said to you? I'm not doing it for him, I said. I'm doing it for us and for everyone he put down who deserved better. The next Monday I stood in front of Hargrove Dynamics' executive board, a room full of sharp suits, skeptical eyes, and half-hidden disdain. Richard introduced me. This is Daniel Carter. He's going to help us rebuild our brand. There was an audible groan from one of the directors, the bakery guy. Another smirked. What's he going to do, feed our investors pastries until they forget we're broke? I could have snapped back, but instead I smiled. Actually, I said, I'm going to feed them something better, trust. The room went silent. You've spent years selling machines, I continued, but forgot you were selling yourselves. People don't buy from companies, they buy from stories, and right now your story is arrogance and collapse. We're going to rewrite it. Richard watched me quietly. I saw something flicker in his eyes, maybe respect, maybe surprise. I started small, focusing on internal morale. I made sure employees knew their voices mattered. We ran social media campaigns showing real workers instead of stock photos. I filmed interviews with engineers, floor managers, even janitors, asking them what Hargrove Dynamics meant to them. We called it Rebuilding the Legacy. And somehow it worked. The public started seeing the company not as a failing giant but as a wounded family trying to rise again. Orders began to trickle back in. Investors called cautiously curious. And Richard, he started changing too. He'd stop by my office more often. Less arrogance, more humility. One day he even said, "You were right, Daniel, big things do start small." I smiled. "Took you long enough to see that." We both laughed. For the first time it felt genuine. But just as things started to look up, the past found its way back in. One night, while reviewing old financial reports, I noticed something odd: a transfer. Millions of dollars moved into an external account labeled as a consulting expense. But the name attached to it wasn't a vendor. It was Mark Weston, Richard's longtime CFO. I called Richard immediately. "Did you know about these transactions?" He frowned. "Of course, Mark handled our consultancy budgets." "Richard," I said, pointing to the screen, "Mark wasn't paying consultants, he was paying himself." The blood drained from his face. "Are you sure?" "Positive, he's been embezzling millions." Richard buried his face in his hands. "God, I trusted him for 30 years. That night he didn't go home. We stayed in that office until dawn, piecing together every transfer, every forged invoice, every lie. By morning, we knew the truth. Hargrove Dynamics hadn't fallen because of bad luck, it had fallen because of betrayal. We called Mark in for a meeting. When he walked in, he acted smug, like nothing was wrong. "Morning, gentlemen," he said. "Ready for the weekly?" "Cut the act," Richard snapped. "We know." Mark froze. I slid the printed statements across the table. For a second, his confidence shattered. Then, like a true snake, he tried to recover. "You don't understand," he said. "Those were temporary reallocations." "Reallocations?" Richard hissed. "You stole from me, from my family." Mark's mask dropped. "Your company was dying, Richard. I just made sure I got something out before it went under." I stepped forward. "You almost destroyed it completely." He looked at me with disdain. "And who are you, the son-in-law with the cookie shop?" That was his mistake. Because Richard stood up, slammed his fist on the table, and said something I'll never forget. "He's the reason this company isn't already dead." Mark's eyes widened. For once, I didn't have to defend myself. We called security. Mark was escorted out. It was over, or at least we thought it was. For the next few months, things improved dramatically. Richard leaned on me more, too much maybe. Every decision went through me. He'd say things like, "You've got the golden touch, Daniel," or "You should have been my son all along." And though part of me was touched, another part felt uneasy. Because sometimes the same pride that destroys a man doesn't disappear, it just hides. Then one day, a board member named Clara pulled me aside. "You're doing great work, Daniel," she said softly, "but be careful." "Of what?" She hesitated. "Of him, Richard. He's grateful now, but men like him don't stay humble for long. When this company stabilizes, he'll want the credit." I laughed it off at first. I don't care about credit. But I should have listened. Because the day would come when all my work, all my sacrifices would be turned against me. A few weeks later, Richard invited me to a press conference. "Big day," he said proudly. "We're announcing the company's restructuring and new leadership direction. I want you there beside me." I nodded. It felt right, like the end of a long, painful road. I wore my best suit, stood by his side as the cameras flashed. He began his speech. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for believing in Hargrove Dynamics. Today marks not just a financial comeback, but a moral one." Applause. "And it's all thanks to our incredible team and my son-in-law, Daniel Carter, whose creativity and resilience have been a beacon through the storm." More applause. For a moment I was proud, but then he said something that made my stomach twist. "However," Richard continued, "as part of our new structure, I've decided to assume full executive control once again. Daniel will be stepping back to focus on his other ventures." Wait, what? The cameras kept flashing. My name trended on social media that day, not as the man who saved Hargrove Dynamics, but as the helpful consultant thanked and quietly dismissed. Behind the scenes, he'd already filed the paperwork removing me from all official company roles. Just like that, I was out. That night, I confronted him in his office. "Why?" I demanded. After everything I did for you, after everything I gave up, why cut me out? He didn't even look up from his desk. Don't take it personally, Daniel. You were great at fixing the mess, but leadership, that's still my job. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Your job, I said bitterly, your job almost destroyed your family's name. He finally looked up, cold as marble, and yet, Daniel, it still carries it. My name built this company, you were just a temporary solution. I stared at him, realizing Clara had been right, the arrogance hadn't vanished. It had just been waiting for the right moment to show its face again. That night I sat in my car outside the bakery, the one place that was truly mine. Emily found me there, her eyes were red, she already knew. He told me what he did, she said quietly. I'm so sorry. I shook my head. He'll never change, Em. I could save his life, his company, his name, and he'd still find a way to remind me I'm beneath him. She touched my hand, then stopped saving him. Her voice trembled, but there was steel in it. Let him fall, Daniel. This time let him feel what you felt. And that was the moment everything shifted. The baker he once mocked, the man who wanted peace, was gone. In his place stood someone who had learned the recipe for something far more dangerous than bread. There's a saying in the culinary world, the sweeter the dessert, the longer the prep. And revenge, I realized, is no different. I didn't want to destroy Richard overnight, that would have been too easy, too merciful. No, I wanted him to watch it happen. To feel it rising around him inch by inch until he realized too late that he was drowning in his own pride. And so quietly, patiently, I started baking my revenge. The first thing I did was step back from everything Hargrove. Publicly, I played the part of the humbled son-in-law, the one who had been grateful to help but was returning to his true passion. Behind the scenes, I went back to the bakery and turned Daniel's dough into something much bigger. We launched Dough Direct, an online gourmet subscription service delivering artisan pastries nationwide. Within 2 months, we had over 30,000 subscribers, mostly working professionals who wanted a taste of home. Ironically, many of those clients were corporate offices, including some that had once worked with Hargrove Dynamics. While Richard tried to rebuild his corporate empire, I built a cultural one. But that was just the start. Remember Clara, the board member who'd warned me about Richard? One evening she called me. Daniel, she said, you should know Richard's making moves behind the scenes. He's trying to secure a new government contract. If he gets it, he'll have full control again. I leaned back in my chair, and if he does? She hesitated, then the company collapses for good. That night I couldn't sleep, because I knew something Richard didn't. That contract worth $200 million was open for competitive partnership proposals. He wasn't guaranteed to win it, he needed allies, reputable brands. Brands like mine. A few weeks later I was invited to a corporate networking event, same circles Richard used to dominate. I wasn't planning to go until I saw the guest list. Hargrove Dynamics was pitching their revival campaign, and the lead investor panel included 2 clients who'd recently joined my bakery subscription program. Fate was practically handing me the whisk. I went. When I arrived, Richard's face said it all, shock, then irritation. Well, he said through gritted teeth, if it isn't my favorite baker. Just here to mingle, I replied, smiling. Networking, good for small businesses, right? He smirked, sure, just try not to get flour on the tablecloths. Classic Richard. But I didn't take the bait. Instead, I turned my charm on everyone else. I told my story, the journey from failed banker to baker to brand builder. People ate it up, literally and figuratively. By the end of the night, half the room was talking about Daniel's dough and the concept of emotional branding. I left before Richard's presentation even started, but I knew I'd left something behind, doubt. Because for the first time, his story wasn't the one people were talking about. 2 days later, Richard called me. Daniel, he said curtly, I'm hearing chatter that you're pitching branding services to my investors. Care to explain? I chuckled. I didn't pitch anything, I just told my story. If they found it interesting, that's on them. He growled, don't play games with me. Oh, Richard, I said softly, I learned that from you. Then I hung up. That was the first real crack in his voice I'd ever heard. But I wasn't done, not yet. Through Clara and a few quiet contacts, I learned more about the government contract. The procurement committee was looking for a sustainability-focused partnership, companies that could prove they were ethical, transparent, and community-driven. That word, community-driven, was my secret weapon. I had built my entire brand on community engagement. Richard's company, on the other hand, was infamous for exploiting small vendors and underpaying contractors. So I built a counterproposal, one that looked nothing like a bakery brand but everything like the future of sustainable manufacturing. We called it the Hearth Project. It was a collaborative initiative between Daniel's Dough, a green logistics startup, and a series of small-town workshops, using biodegradable packaging, renewable energy, and fair trade partnerships. It was wholesome, authentic, and deadly because it appealed to exactly what the committee wanted. A week before the contract review, Clara invited me to a private pre-meeting dinner, informal, but attended by several of the same officials who would later vote on the proposal. I almost didn't go, but then I remembered something Richard once said to me at that humiliating birthday dinner. Real men build companies, not cupcakes. So I wore my best suit and brought a box of cupcakes, branded with the Hearth Project logo. When one of the officials laughed and said, "You brought dessert," I smiled. "Not dessert," I said, "a reminder that the best things in business, like life, are built from the ground up." It landed perfectly. By the time dinner ended, they were asking me questions, serious ones, about community-based production and small business partnerships. The next day, Richard called me again. His tone was different this time, almost afraid. "Daniel, I just heard from the committee. They're considering some Hearth project as an alternate bid. What is that?" I paused. "Oh, that's me." Silence. Then quietly, "You're competing against me." I smiled, though he couldn't see it. "Not competing, Richard, just applying the lessons you taught me. Business, not baking, remember?" The day of the final presentation felt surreal. We were both scheduled to present, one after the other. When Richard saw me walk into that conference room, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break a tooth. He went first. His pitch was old school: numbers, projections, legacy talk. He used buzzwords like stability and tradition. Then it was my turn. I walked up with no slides, just a small loaf of bread in my hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "this loaf represents more than food. It represents people. Farmers, millers, bakers, workers, every hand that touches it matters. That's what the Hearth Project stands for, a return to human business." I could feel the room shift, eyes softened, heads nodded. Then I delivered the final blow. I learned the importance of connection from someone who once told me that passion isn't business. I'm here today to prove that passion is the future of business. When I stepped down, Richard's face was white. He knew. The results came in 2 weeks later. Hargrove Dynamics lost, the Hearth Project won the contract. The government's official statement praised our innovation, ethical vision, and community-first model. My phone exploded with messages. Investors, journalists, celebrities, everyone wanted a piece of Daniel's Dough and the Hearth Project. Richard's board revolted. Half of them resigned, the rest demanded he step down. And when he refused, they voted him out. Publicly. It made headlines for days. Baker beats billionaire, small business wins government megadeal. The fall of Hargrove Dynamics, the rise of Daniel Carter. I didn't smile when I read them, not because I wasn't proud, but because it all felt heavy. Revenge doesn't taste like victory, it tastes like truth, raw and uncomfortable. A month later, I was closing the bakery when I heard the doorbell. It was him. Richard stood there, older somehow, smaller, no suit, no arrogance, just a man holding his hat in his hands. "Daniel," he said softly, "can we talk?" I hesitated, then nodded. He looked around the bakery at the photos of our team, the awards, the shelves of bread and pastries. "You really built this," he said, "all of it." I crossed my arms. "You sound surprised." He chuckled weakly. "I shouldn't be, you always had something I never did." "What's that?" He looked at me, eyes tired but sincere, heart. For the first time in years, there was no venom in his voice. "I came to say I'm sorry," he continued. "Not for losing, I deserved that, but for not seeing you, for not believing in you." I didn't know what to say. Emily told me everything you did, he said quietly, how you helped even when I didn't deserve it. You're a better man than I ever was. There was silence for a long time. Finally I asked, what will you do now? He shrugged, start over I guess, maybe finally learn how to make a decent loaf of bread. I couldn't help it, I laughed. He smiled faintly, like he hadn't heard laughter in months. Then he said something that stuck with me forever. I spent my whole life chasing power, you found it by feeding people. After he left, I stood there in the quiet bakery, the smell of fresh bread all around me. Emily walked in a few minutes later. How was it? She asked. I sighed. Strange, he apologized. She smiled. That's rare. Yeah, I said, almost makes me wish it hadn't come to this. She put her arms around me, but it had to. Some people only learn when everything crumbles. I nodded slowly. Outside, the night air was cool. A soft breeze carried the scent of cinnamon and rain. And for the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Not the kind that comes from winning, but the kind that comes from understanding. That even the sweetest revenge isn't about proving someone wrong, it's about proving yourself right. You know that strange quiet after a storm when everything's still wet but the world feels lighter, like it's been rinsed clean. That's what life felt like after Richard left my bakery that night. For years, I'd imagined what his downfall would look like. Maybe he'd lose everything, maybe he'd crawl back in shame, but the reality, it wasn't as satisfying as I thought it'd be. It was human, painfully human. Because the truth is, revenge only gives you closure when you've made peace with yourself. And I finally had. The Hearth project exploded. Our team grew from 20 employees to 200 in less than 6 months. We opened new facilities, launched sustainability programs, and even partnered with community colleges to train young bakers and small business owners. We weren't just baking bread anymore, we were baking opportunity. Everywhere I went, people recognized me not as the baker who beat the billionaire, but as someone who had proven that small could be strong. Reporters called, podcasts invited me to talk about purpose-driven business. One morning, I woke up to a headline that said, Daniel Carter, the man who turned mockery into a movement. And yet, even with all that attention, I still opened the bakery at 5 a.m. every morning. Because the dough doesn't care how successful you are, it just needs to be kneaded. A few months later, a business magazine invited me for a feature interview. We sat in my office, sunlight pouring through the window, flour dust dancing in the air. The journalist leaned forward and asked, Daniel, what would you say to someone who doesn't believe in you, who says your dreams are too small? I smiled. I'd tell them, I said, that the size of your dream doesn't matter. What matters is the size of your heart when you chase it. Then she asked, do you think your father-in-law knows that now? I paused. Yeah, I said quietly, I think he does. That quote ended up going viral, not because it was clever, but because people felt it. Suddenly, my inbox was full of messages from people around the world, dreamers, hustlers, bakers, artists, all saying the same thing. Thank you for making us believe again. That's when I realized something. Revenge had turned into something far greater. It had turned into inspiration. One evening, about 8 months after everything went down, I got a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single object, a silver cufflink. At first I didn't recognize it, then it hit me. It was Richard's, the same pair he used to wear every day with his initials engraved, RH. There was a note tucked beneath it, written in his sharp, precise handwriting. Daniel, I've started over, a small consulting firm, no board, no politics, just me. It's humble work, but for once it feels honest. I don't expect forgiveness. I just hope you'll remember that even old bread can make new crumbs, Richard. I stared at that line for a long time. Even old bread can make new crumbs. I laughed through tears, because for the first time, Richard wasn't teaching me a lesson, he was learning one. A year later, the city invited me to speak at their annual entrepreneurship and small business festival, the same event where once upon a time, Richard had given a keynote speech titled Scaling Beyond Sentiment. The irony wasn't lost on me. When I walked onto that stage, the hall was packed. Bakers, students, CEOs, families, people from every walk of life. I looked at the crowd and said, once someone told me passion isn't business, that emotion clouds judgment. But today I'm standing here to tell you emotion is the foundation of business, because when you care about what you create, people feel it, and they care too. The applause was thunderous. But as the crowd quieted, I noticed someone standing near the back, older, wearing a simple gray jacket. It was Richard. He wasn't hiding, he wasn't pretending, he just listened. And when our eyes met, he gave a small nod, proud, not bitter. That moment, more than any headline or award, meant everything. After the event, he waited for me by the exit. "Good speech," he said. "Thanks," I replied, "didn't think you'd show up." He smiled faintly. "Didn't think I'd want to either, but I had to see it for myself." There was a pause, then he said, "You did it, Daniel, you proved me wrong, and I've never been happier to be wrong." I laughed softly, "That's a first." He grinned, "Yeah, well, life's funny that way. I spent decades teaching people how to win, but you're the first one who taught me how to lose." That hit me deep. He continued, "You know, if you ever need help scaling the Hearth project, I'd be honored to contribute." I blinked, "You'd work for me." He chuckled, "Don't push it, let's just say I'll finally take your calls." We both laughed. For the first time, it wasn't awkward. It was peace. That night, Emily and I sat on the bakery rooftop, watching the city lights flicker. "You think he's changed?" she asked. I thought about it for a while. "I think he's learning too," I said, "and that's enough." She smiled. "You know, my mom used to say the Hargrove men were born without humility. Maybe you're proving her wrong too." I laughed. "Let's not go that far." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "Still, I'm proud of you, not for winning, for forgiving." I didn't respond right away, because deep down I knew she was right. Revenge had brought me victory, but forgiveness, that brought me peace. A few weeks later, I was closing the bakery when a teenage boy came in, nervous and holding a small box. "Mr. Carter," he said shyly, "my mom works at the packaging plant you guys partnered with. She said you gave them all bonuses last month, and I just wanted to say thanks." He handed me the box. Inside was a small loaf of bread, homemade, uneven, imperfect. "I baked it myself," he said. "It's not great, but I'm learning." I smiled. "It's perfect." After he left, I sat down and took a bite. It was rough around the edges, but it tasted like effort, like hope. And I thought, this is what it's all about, not the revenge, not the contracts, not the money. Just people. The ones who rise, fall, and rise again. A year later, we opened our first training center, the Hearth Academy, dedicated to teaching small business owners how to build sustainable, purpose-driven brands. The sign out front said, "Built from passion, strengthened by humility." At the ribbon cutting, Emily whispered he'd be proud. "Who?" I asked. She smiled knowingly. "You know who." And yeah, I did. A few months later, Richard and I met again, this time at a quiet cafe near the river. He looked healthier, lighter. He'd even grown a bit of a beard, which was new. "Consulting's treating you well," I said. He grinned. "Turns out I'm a decent teacher, who knew?" We talked for a while, not about business but about life, about Emily, the grandkids, even about bread recipes. Then he leaned back and said, "You know, Daniel, I used to think legacy was about how much you built, but now I think it's about how many people you helped build themselves." I nodded. "I used to think revenge was about payback, but it's really about growth." He smiled. "Guess we both learned something, huh?" "Yeah," I said, "we did." We sat in silence for a while, watching the sun set over the river. For once, there were no power plays, no bitterness, just two men who had finally learned to see each other. If you'd told me years ago that the man who mocked me would one day respect me, I'd have laughed, but life has a way of humbling even the proudest hearts. Richard taught me that failure isn't the opposite of success, it's part of it, and I taught him that kindness doesn't make you weak, it makes you unstoppable. In the end, I didn't just save his company, I saved a part of him he didn't even know he'd lost. When people hear my story, they always ask, "Daniel, what was the best moment, the revenge, the contract, the victory?" And I tell them none of that. The best moment was when I looked my father-in-law in the eye and realized I didn't hate him anymore. Because that's when I finally won. So to anyone listening, maybe you've been mocked. Maybe someone told you your dream is too small, too silly, too soft. Let them talk. Because one day they might have to call you for help, and when they do, don't gloat, don't rub it in, just smile, extend your hand and say, "Welcome to the table." Because the sweetest revenge is serving success with grace.